Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Helen Dellinger, curator of the Manassas Museum System. Thank you for joining us today for our Spotlight on History. I'm coming to you in our empty exhibit hallway. We're between shows outside our NPR here at the museum. And I needed a little bit of space to spread out today because these newspapers take up a lot of room. This is a special request program that we're bringing to you today. It was requested by Denise A., one of our top fans on Facebook. And she wanted to know something about the newspapers in our collection, a little bit more about them, and we thought that was a great idea. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So first, before we get started, some numbers. Our database tells me that we have 71 newspapers in our collection. Of that, 14 of the 71 are just clippings, not full editions. They're just little pieces of papers that people have given us over the years. The remaining 57 newspapers contain 29 different publications from Manassas, as well as Alexandria, Richmond, and Washington, D.C. Several other states are also represented: Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and South Carolina, as well as Ohio. So you might wonder why we collect newspapers that are not from here, since we are the Manassas Museum. And the answer is that most of those newspapers that I mentioned are 1861 and 1862 editions that contain information about the first and second battles of Manassas. And it's always very interesting to see how other localities were reporting on news that was taking place here. So that's why we have those. So those are just a little bit about the newspapers in our collection in general. Now, before we get started, to understand newspapers from this time, and we have mid-19th century, early 20th century, and then a couple of specialty newspapers that I'm going to share with you. So to help you understand those newspapers, a little bit of background. So newspapers of that time all shared certain characteristics. First of all of them had a front page of the newspaper, and that had the title and information like date, volume, and issue number, and sometimes the place of publication. Some of these newspapers would also put the name of the person that published it, because most newspapers were privately owned, the smaller publications. Another common feature that many of you might not realize that newspapers have was called a masthead, and this would appear not on page 1, but inside on page 2 or 3. The reason for that is that pages 1 and then the back page were always printed first to allow the ink to dry. So then that's why they would print the masthead on the inside later, along with editorials and other things of that nature. They always came in on the inside. So newspapers organized, the rest of their pages varied by publication. Some papers, as you'll see on these, have a lot of advertisements on their front page. Others have a combination of news and ads. Some stories and current news did appear on the insides of the paper. Again, they held the most current news for the pages that were printed last. So that's why you see current news on the inside, because the first page and the last page were printed first to allow the ink to dry. They're like the covers of the paper. Newspapers contain surprisingly little local news, sometimes none at all. They just didn't print that type of stuff. Some of the bigger editions. They dealt with government, politics, and commerce, news about wars, science, medicine, agriculture, disasters that had happened elsewhere, like earthquakes or bad storms or floods. In addition, you'll find things like original poetry, some small stories, works of fiction, and a lot of newspapers, especially major ones, reprinted stories from smaller papers rather than try and go out and get all their own news. And they expected that their stories would also be carried elsewhere. So now that you have all of that information, we'll start here on my right, your left. Let me slide this over, because as we were setting up, we moved this where it shouldn't be. All right, so this is the Friday, April 28th, 1911 of the Manassas Journal. So many of you may remember the Manassas Journal Messenger. That was a combination of two papers, the Journal and the Messenger. I've kept it inside this Mylar cover because it's in very bad shape, as you can see, and to take it out would be bad, and we don't want that to get any worse. So this newspaper has a lot of different stories on the front page. You can see the columns run down, so rather than being the bigger, wider columns like we're used to today, this one has 6 columns. It has a story down here at the bottom about oil prospecting, and that it didn't go well. And so the people that put their money into it are not going to realize their investments. On the back page, we'll flip that over very carefully. You'll see some more ads. This entire column here, the third column on the paper, is a sports story about Prince William's public schools competing in an athletic contest. It looks like track and field. As you read through this, you'll notice that only boys were competing in this. Girls did not participate in organized sports in school, at least not in track and field at that time. So you only see the boys here. And then a really interesting story on the front. I thought it was interesting because it says a lot about what's going on in Manassas at the time. We'll flip it back over. This here says, a new board ordered. The switchboard at Manassas Central to be replaced with one more modern. I'm reading this upside down, so bear with me. So it talks here a little bit in this article about the new switchboard that they have to get. And apparently it was a very big deal to get this new switchboard because the telephone service was not working correctly. Now, if you know anything about switchboard service at the time, you'll know that the nickname that was common, that was used for lady telephone operators at the time, was "Hello Girls." And this term was first used in the United States since callers were greeted with a very polite hello when they used the phone. You had to dial the switchboard. There was no direct dialing. You would dial the switchboard and ask to be connected and give your number, or sometimes just a name if it was a small enough town. And women were preferred for this job since they had very gentle and polite voices. So this is an article about the new switchboard that they were getting here in Manassas to direct all the calls that were coming through the area. So we'll move on over here to the middle of the table and jump back about 50 or plus years in time to 1861. And we're going to show two of this paper, so I am going to slide this over very carefully on top of the Journal Messengers we just saw. So as you can see, this newspaper is called The South, and here you'll notice at the top that it's printed in Baltimore. Both editions from 1861, this one from July 29th, that one from July 25th. Now, we did have one of these that just came down from our Consider the Source exhibition. Now, again, this newspaper was printed in Baltimore, Maryland by a man named Thomas Hall Jr. He was very much in favor of the South, pro-secessionist, and his newspaper reflected those views. Now, unfortunately, his reliance on the First Amendment, Mr. Hall's reliance on the First Amendment, did not keep him out of trouble. He was arrested and put in jail in Baltimore for publishing these papers with its views against the government. And his friends continued to try and publish the paper, but it did not succeed without him at the helm, and it eventually was entirely shut down by the military authorities on February 17, 1862. So the main story in this July issue right here is all about the suspension of the writ of Habeas Corpus in Maryland, which of course he was about ready to experience for himself. And that's a person who's been arrested is supposed to be able to have a speedy trial. So this is a big story that he's written, and you can see the tiny little type, and it just goes on and on and on, and it's all about that. And the second issue here has a summary about the Battle of First Manassas, and it has a decidedly pro-Southern slant. So this is another story that got him into a little bit of trouble. Now, note the interesting ads on the fronts of these papers. So there's one here for the railroad, and you know it's a railroad because you can see here the little steam train that they've got right there. And then down here are other ones, and this one has a steamboat in it. So engravings like these were very generic, and they were used from publication to publication. The South might use them, then you might find them in the New York Times and other newspapers around the country. And that's because you couldn't use photographs back then. Photographs, it's a whole thing on how you reproduce photographs in newspapers. It's very complicated. I'm not going to go into that here. But woodcut engravings were what they used to get images into newspapers. So they tended to use the same ones over and over and over again. And then the ads were also the same. You'll notice here that we have, now I found this once before, so I hope I can find it again. There was a tobacco ad that is the same. In one of these, the tobacco ad is run twice. It's this one right here, Claiborne and Ferguson here, and you'll see it again right over here. And it's the same exact ad. Now that's not uncommon. They would just tend to take out the same ad and they would set it up once, and then that's all you'd have to do. Newspapers like this also, you'll see, were not multiple pages like what we have today. They didn't have sections like sports and then real estate and then news. It was mostly, this was a one-page paper folded in two, so you get four pages, one sheet of paper folded into four. So that's pretty typical of what you'd see at the time. Now, in addition to these types of papers that are in our collection, I'd like to go on to the school newspapers that we have. The museum actually has a lot of school newspapers. And for those of you that are familiar with Swably School, which was the school that stood right here on this property where the museum is, they actually published a newspaper called the Swably Sentinel. And you can see here it's got Manassas on it. This is a 1929 edition. Now, this newspaper, of course, was published by the student body of Swably, and this is its commencement issue. So the entire thing is about graduation, and they talk about different alumni in it as well. You do see some photographs reproduced in this paper by this time, much later than the 1861 South that we just looked at. So this also has some ads on the inside, but again, not a lot of images, mostly just columns of print. Again, very tiny. Papers were expensive to put out, so you wanted to get the biggest bang for your buck. And they likely printed this somewhere here in town. I'm imagining that the local papers helped them out with that. So this is an interesting school newspaper that we have, and we have several of these. We also have some yellow jackets from Osborne High School, Osborne Park High School. Now, I want to end today with a fun newspaper that we were given just recently, actually. This newspaper came out on April 1st, 1985, and it's the Journal Messenger. Again, this is the combination of the Journal and the Messenger. And I'm going to hold it up here, and we're going to see if you all can figure out there in Facebook land. Does it look strange to you? Okay, so the entire thing was printed backwards. And I'll have Rachel, my great videographer, zoom in on the date here, also printed backwards. Monday, April 1st, 1982. So what I have not been able to find out is if this April Fool's joke was limited to just a few papers that you could get as a joke just at the newspaper office, or if they did their entire run that day backwards. I've never seen another one, but I think that's funny that the newspaper would actually go ahead and do that just to have some fun. Whoever the editors and the publishers were at that time were fantastic. I had a great sense of humor. Thanks today for joining us. That's all we have. I hope you come back next week when we bring you some pieces in our collection from the Peace Jubilee from 1911. And we're going to try and come to you from a special location if the weather permits. So that'll give you a little bit of a clue that we're going to be outside. I'm Mary Helen Dellinger, and I'll see you soon.